Okay, so in yesterday's video, we just introduced chapter 10, which essentially is going to be all of what we've learned in 7, 8, and 9, but instead of one sample, we're looking at 2. So today, I've decided we're actually going to focus on confidence intervals of both proportions and means. So we're going to be looking at how to construct confidence interval for 2 proportions or 2 means. So please grab a piece of paper. We're going to do what we did yesterday, and we are going to take just one quick sheet of notes before we do example problems. So we're going to use our state, plan, do, conclude method. And so in our state, just like we did for significance test, we're going to name our parameter of interest. This time, I do want you to note, though, we're going to have 2 proportions, or we're going to have 2 means, one from each population. For example, it might be like, let P1 equal the proportion of females that who play sports. Let P2 equal the proportion of males that play sports. You may even want to, normally I do it in the do section, but all of them, if we're comparing, we're going to be writing them as differences. You might want to decide at the very beginning, we're going to do, our difference is going to be P1 minus P2. So you might want to just decide how you're going to write that difference, females minus males. So sometime at the very beginning of your problem, you want to decide just how you're going to write that difference. And that'll make more sense once we do a problem. So then you're going to name your test, just like we did. So in our plan section, we're going to name our test and check our conditions. Even if it's an interval, we find that under the test section in our calculator. So we're just going to say, we're going to name that test. If it's proportions, your test is going to be a 2 proportion Z interval. If you're talking about means, we're going to be using 2 sample T interval. Remember, Z goes with proportions and T goes with samples. I put where you find this in your calculator as well. So our 2 proportion Z interval is 8, and our 2 sample T interval is 0. So our conditions are the same as they've always been since chapter 7, random, independence, and normality. But remember, you have to check them for both samples. Random, it's either stated or it isn't. For independence, that's our 10% rule, but you have to do it twice, right? 10 in 1 is less than or equal to population 1. Maybe that's 10 times the sample from the females is less than or equal to the number of females in that population. 10 times N2 is less than or equal to population 2. This is the same for means. Our random and independence checks, they're the same. Those are little ditto marks. Same. For normality for proportions, remember our normality count is large count. Our normality check is large count. So we need at least 10 successes and at least 10 failures. But you're going to have to do that for both populations. So N1 times P1, N2 times P2. Now, do note for confidence intervals, we don't actually have a P. We have a P hat. But same idea. For normality, for means, remember we have 2 different options. They either tell you it's stated or we use CLT. It doesn't even have to be the same method for each samples. Just each of the 2 samples, you have to make sure it meets one of these criteria for your normality condition. Actually, this would actually be a good place to put for P1 minus P2. You just need some place like to name that. That's a place that makes a lot of sense. Because if you're naming your test, you're just like, okay, we're going to use a 2 proportion Z interval for P1 minus P2. But somewhere you got to tell which way you're doing that direction. This is a good spot for it, though. Okay. And then we're going to do the do section. So our do section, we're just going to actually run the test. And then so for our 2 proportion Z interval, our final answer is just going to be an interval. The same for this. So our final answer that we're recording, they're just an interval. That's it. That's just when you're typing it in. Remember, our calculators are going to ask for an X and an N in a confidence level. They're going to ask for 2 X's and N's. It's going to be X1, N2, X1, N1, X2, N2, and your confidence level. So remember, you do have 2 samples, but your final answer will just be an interval. And then finally, your conclude. Your conclude is just going to be interpreting the interval in context. But remember, when we interpret an interval in context, it's going to be we are C% confident that the true And this time our parameter that we're interested is a difference. So look back up here, see how you wrote that? The true difference in P1 minus P2. Of course, this would be in context. You'll know what they are because you'll have defined them up there. The true difference in proportions between males and females who play sports, whatever the case is. But your parameter is going to be a difference. And go ahead and list what direction you subtracted again. And then you would say is between blank and blank. And that's all there is to it. And then in the next video, which will still be today, in the next video, we'll do 2 examples.